Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing, as well as analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. We have lots of stuff to get through in today's video. I'd like to start things out, though, with an update to GA102, which is perhaps better known as RTX 3080 Ti or RTX 3090. There's some ambiguity as to what Nvidia will actually call the GPU, but nevertheless there is an update to the specifications and feature set from Moore's Law is Dead. I'll link his video, of course, in the description of this one. To summarise, the GPU has 5376 CUDA cores, 18 GBps RAM, and can hit about 2 GHz with boosting, but it can hit 2200 MHz if you crank up the fans and basically overclock the card. But in doing this, it can exceed over 400 watts of power consumption, which I'm sure you'll agree is not exactly indicative of a silent running card. It's going to be very interesting if this is true, if we're looking at another Thermi on our hands. As for performance, 40% faster in rasterization at 4K, and ray tracing performance 3 to 4 times greater compared to the RTX 2080 Ti. The 40-ish% performance increase in traditional rasterization performance is not unexpected. There have been some exceptions to this. For example, what we saw with the 980 to the 1080, it was basically double the performance. But in general, 40 to 50% from one architecture to the next is not unheard of from Nvidia. It's going to be curious, though, if this is true, because we've already seen so many leaks from AMD that the RDNA 2 GPUs are basically just monsters. We believe there's up to 80 compute units on the highest end SKU, and given that there's an IPC gain for RDNA 2, this is something I leaked but has also been confirmed by AMD themselves, I'm guessing about a 10% plus gain, which is no small feat, plus a higher clock frequency as well. I think Nvidia will have definitely a lot to think about in terms of how they're going to be pricing their cards. And this is further emphasised too because AMD's feature set will no longer be really behind Ampere. Although there are a couple of interesting things, at least according to Tom. DLSS 3 will be much easier to implement. As long as the game-ready driver is updated, the actual programmer themselves doesn't need to do as much work. The update from DLSS 1 to DLSS 2, which I went over extensively in a video, I actually think was really impressive. DLSS 2 does a much better job of upsampling from a lower quality image than DLSS 1. With DLSS 1, especially with like hair and other fine details, there were, well, honestly, it just wasn't great. But with DLSS 2, very frequently you just couldn't tell the difference between the native image and the machine upsampled image. In fact, at times it was actually better quality. So I think Nvidia did a really good job there. So DLSS 3 becoming even more refined, I wouldn't be surprised. I think DLSS 3 is going to be a really important tool for Nvidia. I think some type of upsampling tech as well for AMD makes sense. But obviously, AMD are implementing it differently because they don't have the tensor cores. So with AMD, they instead run, I believe, the operations to be at a lower precision. A little bit like we've seen Microsoft talk about with the Xbox Series X. Other than this, though, according to Tom, there is also essentially an answer to HBCC, which basically acts as like a massive cache. I'll be interested to see how this is utilised with games. I suspect that this is going to be of paramount importance with games given what we're seeing, of course, with both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, and also the tensor cores can be used with memory decompression, or sorry, memory compression and decompression. I wonder too if this can be used similarly to what we're seeing the console decompression blocks do as well. But obviously, at the end of the day, A, all of this information may be inaccurate, and B, we don't really have a full picture or understanding of how this tech works yet. And now, on to Sony and the PlayStation 5, because the folks over at Insomniac have an announcement. That's right, we get to play Miles Morales' Spider-Man at 4K 60 FPS with a performance mode. Now, from what we understood, originally the game was only running at 30 FPS, and it does obviously feature things such as hardware-based ray tracing, but Insomniac have included a performance mode. Unfortunately, we don't have a full understanding as to the difference between performance mode and regular plain old, let's say, graphics fidelity mode. If I had to take a guess, there is not upsampling going on here simply because of the wording of 4K. Now, it is possible that there is some type of upsampling tech being used, and given we don't have images really of the performance mode, it's also very difficult to do any type of analysis of whether, let's say, hardware-based ray tracing is being disabled. But I think that the CPU on this machine is not going to be the limiting factor hitting 60 FPS. Indeed, I've recently done a video where I've explained why 30 FPS is still going to be a thing with the next generation. This is not to say that all games will be 30 FPS, and I mentioned in that specific video that I expect performance mode to be a lot more common. One of the reasons that on this generation, so PS4, Xbox One, and that of course includes the Pro systems, that performance mode wasn't more consistent is because often it was the CPU that was holding things back. So even if they were to render the game at, let's just say something ridiculously low like 720p, or even lower, 600p, it wouldn't make the difference because the CPU was just incapable of hitting the higher frame rates. Not only did the CPU need to run the game world itself, as well as issue commands to the GPU for drawing stuff, but it also needed to do other things too, such as decompress data which was coming in from the hard drive, and even the audio, because the CPUs and the machines were actually the thing that was ultimately responsible for handling most of the audio stuff. And those CPUs as well were kind of weedy. Like the PS4 was only 1600 megahertz with an AMD Jaguar, and the Jaguar is not exactly the fastest CPU even at the time that it was new and shiny. So the bottom line is it was a low performance mobile CPU that was designed for low power consumption. It did have some benefits over the Cell processor and Xeon processor that were in the PS3 and the Xbox 360, not least of which being the fact that it was a lot more efficient in terms of how it would handle instructions. It was basically able to do out-of-order execution, which is definitely kind of handy, meaning that it was a lot easier to optimize for. But getting back to the topic here, Insomniac and other studios can therefore implement a performance mode simply by cranking down the amount of work that the GPU needs to handle. So, for example, they could upsample from a lower resolution or use some other type of reconstruction technology. Alternatively, they could also reduce the visual fidelity of the image, such as, for example, either removing or dialing back hardware-based ray tracing. And I think, honestly, that this is a smart decision. When you're dealing with such a massive open world as something like Spider-Man, quite honestly, there is so much for the GPU and system to keep track of. I think it's really awesome that they've actually managed to hit 60 FPS on this with the performance mode, and I'm really happy the performance mode is being implemented. I honestly hope it's consistent with more games, like, for example, Ratchet & Clank having a performance mode as well would be amazing. I suspect Microsoft too, with a lot of their games, will also want to put in a couple of different modes. And I genuinely think that that's the best option, because you are going to get people who are happy to play at 30 FPS, and some games, as I mentioned in my previous video, they are fine at 30 FPS, like a JRPG at 30 FPS, okay, fine. But when you're dealing with like precision controls and stuff, I honestly find 30 FPS kind of jarring, and I've mentioned a couple of times that I know that this is not a popular thing to say, but honestly I'm finding it really difficult to enjoy Final Fantasy VII simply because of the 30 FPS. I find it very difficult when I'm in combat. Like normal running around, I have no issue, but in combat it's really noticeable for me. There's like this lag, and I think this is primarily because I'm a PC gamer. So I'm really happy that this is being implemented in Spider-Man. And in the final piece of news for today, let's talk about Xbox. Colobril, who is a very well-known industry insider, was actually speaking on Reset Era, and he says that just to get the expectation right, I don't think anyone should expect Fable announcement of a gameplay demo like what Halo Infinite will do. I guess this will be more of a Horizon 2 trailer-like ballpark, so it's in-engine trailer but somewhat indicative of what to expect. Also, he states that he believes that the online multiplayer paywall will fall. In other words, Xbox Live Gold will become free. I personally believe that this is a very likely thing for Microsoft to do. I know that technically speaking, Microsoft were the first to push you pay money to play online. I totally get that. And I still find it really alien, mostly as a PC gamer, for this to be a thing. But I think Microsoft either making the ability to play online free, or for it to be bundled in with Game Pass or something else, makes sense. I think Microsoft, and this is not based on industry sources or anything like that, but I think Microsoft saying something like, just like PC, we believe you should be able to play online for free, boom, and there you go. I think honestly it tells up really well, given Microsoft obviously have Windows, a PC-based platform where you can play games for free, but then if you want to play like Halo against a friend using your Xbox, you have to cough up money. I think there's some kind of disconnect there, and I think Microsoft having some type of uniformity in this respect makes sense. Will they do it? Well, honestly, who the hell knows? Well, obviously, some people know, but I personally think it's very likely. I'm also very hyped for the Microsoft event. I'm hearing really good things about Forza. I really am hearing some really good things about Forza. I think that the Xbox event is going to be really good. But I guess we can just see. It's only a few more days. With all of that said, thanks very much for watching the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.